Welcome one and all to Drydock episode 108. This week's questions are taken from two how to pronounce guides, Italian capital ships and Japanese cruisers, the light and heavy ones, as well as the guide to the USS St. Louis and its class, which was Guide 175. The Lost Beaver asks a number of questions, but I've selected two of them that seem to be sort of related. He says, you mentioned in the Baltic 1919 video that they were trying to put a coal-fired power plant from Andrei Pervozvany or a similar ship into one of the Gangut class. Assuming the required personnel, infrastructure and time were available, what effect would this have had on the performance of the ship? And slightly separately, what would have happened if Erebus and any of its escorts ran into Andrei Pervozvany and its escorts, and how does this change if Terror, for whatever reason, was added to the mix? So, if they had managed the transplant of power plants, well, the older Russian pre-dreadnought had less than half, in fact, well less than half of the power output that the Ganguts required to move at their full speed. So it definitely would not have been moving at any kind of speed vaguely commensurate with what the Ganguts were designed for. But on the other hand, it doesn't require massive amounts of power to move ships at lower speeds. It ramps up relatively quickly once you get into the higher speed regiments. So I suspect you probably would have been looking at a Gangut that could maybe limp along at maybe 12 to 14 knots, which isn't anything fantastic, but it's better than not moving at all. But the kind of minimal functionality you'd get out of it, and as he mentions, time, personnel, infrastructure, expertise, etc., pretty much meant that it didn't actually happen in the end. So, yeah, it's a case of, well, they were thinking about trying to make do with what they'd got. It's just what they got at the time wasn't particularly great. Now, if they hadn't done that and the ship had gone out, the pre-dreadnought that is, and gone out and fought Erebus and its escorts, well, using on-paper statistics is actually a little bit misleading at this point, because the poor old pre-dreadnought was in a fairly run-down, battered state, but at the same time, Erebus and Terror, whilst they're very heavily armed on paper, they are monitors. So it would have been a rather interesting fight. I think overall, the British escorts probably would have held a slight advantage in as much as their ships were in better repair. The ships were slightly more modern, and so they would have held an upper hand over whatever loose collection of escorts the Russians could put together, or the Soviets, I guess, at that point. And based on the conduct of the Baltic Campaign in 1919, there probably would have been more numerous Royal Navy escorts as well. Now, when you consider the two, well, if you want to call them capital ships, I guess, the pre-dreadnought has considerably more heavy guns. It's got a lot of 8-inch guns as well as its 4 12-inch guns. And it is marginally better protected, albeit the 8.5 inches maximum belt armor is not going to do an awful lot against a 15-inch 42 caliber shell, or a shell from a 15-inch 42 caliber gun, I should say. But it does have 4 main guns, so it's got better accuracy for salvo firing, whereas Erebus and or Terror, if Terror gets involved, they only have 2 guns, so their salvo firing is going to be somewhat less accurate. The flip side, of course, is that Erebus and Terror are probably going to have slightly more accurate modern fire control equipment. So I suspect that with the pre-dreadnought having more guns but less accurate fire control equipment, and probably a lot of it broken, and the monitors having more accurate fire control equipment but fewer guns and therefore less accurate salvo ranging, it's probably going to end up with neither side being able to hit each other at any considerable range and both sides getting closer and closer, at which point it's a bit of a coin toss, because Erebus and Terror are both very, very floaty because they have huge torpedo bulges to try and keep them, well, intact and afloat if they get torpedoed, shockingly enough. And so it's very unlikely that they're going to be sunk by hits from the pre-dreadnought, but at the same time, as I said, they're not particularly well protected, so it's entirely possible that a magazine might be touched off. On the other hand, the Russian ship doesn't really have any meaningful protection against a 15-inch shell hit if one happens to hit. So when they close into what would effectively be in any other naval engagement, probably point-blank firing range, it's going to be a case of luck of the draw. If the Russian ship or Soviet ship starts getting more hits in sooner, then that's probably going to very quickly disable the ability of Erebus to fight back. Whereas if Erebus gets a lucky 15-inch shell hit in first, that's going to probably seriously mess up the Russian or Soviet pre-dreadnought. And so I think on paper, just given the sheer weight of fire, assuming the escorts don't get involved, and as I say, there probably would be torpedoes in flying and everything, but assuming that the escorts are fighting their own little war, I would say the pre-dreadnought versus Erebus on its own, I would probably give it to the Russian or Soviet pre-dreadnought more often than not. If Terror gets involved as well, so it's Erebus and Terror, then one of them is probably going to be relatively unengaged, at which point they're probably going to start scoring heavy hits at some point, sooner or later, at which point they're probably going to win. William Kruger asks, with HMS Dreadnought, all previous battleships were obsolete or at least obsolescent, being relegated to lesser roles or used as disposable substitutes for actual dreadnoughts. But what if instead of being outright superseded, they were instead moved down to a light battleship or second-class battleship role? In that guise, their development would in theory continue throughout the First and even Second World Wars, with steam turbines, radar, fire control, dual-purpose secondary armament, AAR, batteries, etc., higher speeds, but nonetheless half a dreadnought, maybe for World War II a battleship escort designation. They'd be operated in nothing less than pairs, perhaps threes or fours, while still carrying period-appropriate weaponry. With this pre-dreadnought and semi-dreadnought timeline in mind, what do you think would happen? To be honest, it's going to be very difficult to see how this goes down, because when you look at the last generation of pre-dreadnoughts with things like the Lord Nelsons, the Connecticuts, the Dantons, etc., they were moving towards the dreadnought concept anyway, with increasingly heavier secondary batteries, and with some Japanese ships, like the Satsumas, for example, you're actually even going up to same caliber, if not same barrel length weapons. So, yeah, it's difficult to see how the classic pre-dreadnought two twin turrets, 141 aft layout would survive. And also in terms of cost, they're going to be more expensive than cruisers by a long way. They're not going to be obviously as expensive as a full-on battleship, but their crew requirements are going to be quite large. So you're going to end up, if you're paying for, say, two of these, so let's say, I don't know, a late World War I type with a pair of twin 15-inch guns, you're looking at a cost that's going to be, in terms of men and money, that exceeds something like a Revenge or Queen Elizabeth in order to buy two of them. So you have the same kind of firepower, but you have less survivability because it's a smaller ship, probably slightly less armour, and overall less utility, but you're paying more for it. The only advantage you have is it can be in two places at once. And in some ways, minus the armour and perhaps ramping up with the speed, you kind of see that concept with things like HMS Glorious and HMS Courageous, but they're not very successful for a reason. One of the other big disadvantages they'd have in a long-range gunnery duel is that whilst they can fire a 4-gun salvo, which will give them accurate ranging data, a battleship, a full-on battleship, will be able to fire 2 half salvos, each of 4 guns, assuming you're using 4 twin turrets, or if you have the standards, you can use 2 of your triples. And so a full-size battleship facing off against 2 of these things is going to be able to get the accurate range data a lot sooner. So it's going to have an inherent combat advantage even against 2 of them. Now, the only real way I can see this really becoming a reality would be with some very torturous changes to the timeline. But in theory, I suppose if you had it so that there wasn't a Washington Treaty, and on top of that, because there wasn't a Washington Treaty, everyone was suddenly very eager to divest themselves of their older capital ships in an attempt to get as much money as possible, because in the end, if you sell an older ship to another navy, you're probably going to make more money than if you just sell it for scrap to fund your bigger naval arms race. Then in theory, if everyone is that short-sighted, you might suddenly end up with large numbers of smaller navies inheriting last generation pre-dreadnoughts and maybe even first generation dreadnoughts, and then sort of for the larger colonial powers, which, well, for the ones who are in basically still in the arms race, Japan, the UK, the US, and even actually the other colonial powers who aren't directly in the arms race, places like France and Italy, they're not going to want to spend the capital resources to put a full-on modern battleship off to sort of show the flag and enforce their will against these now much stronger secondary navies, because they're going to need to concentrate their G3, N3, South Dakota, Lexington, Tosa, Amagi, etc. fleets at home or in key strategic locations. But they also can't send cruisers, because a cruiser can't face off against a first generation dreadnought or late pre-dreadnought. So at that point, between them and, say, the smaller powers like France and Italy, there might be a kind of light battleship resurgence where that kind of thing, as you describe, might occur, because it will cost less, they can put them in more locations, they have just enough firepower to face off against pretty much anything that might rock up from a smaller navy, and they might have some utility in the battle line. And whilst the crew requirements would be considerable, in this sort of unlimited building race, it would make a small degree of sense if everyone, as I had ditched all their older ships all of a sudden, to build something like a modernised pre-dreadnought purely for effectively flag station roles. Kind of like the HMS Renown of the late 19th century, a kind of a second-class battleship. Come World War II, I can actually see them becoming fleet escorts, because they've got the firepower to see off enemy cruisers and such like. In numbers, they've got the firepower to worry enemy battleships, but it frees up the big battleships to do their own thing. But they're still battleship-sized vessels, even small ones. So, yeah, at that point, I could see them then covering the sides in anti-aircraft guns and making them into kind of an anti-aircraft battleship escort for carrier fleets and convoys and such like. Elite Corsair asks, did the US Navy learn any lessons from their design mistakes with the St. Louis class, or did it take mistakes over several classes of warships to solve design problems? Well, as it would turn out, the St. Louis class was the last class of US protected cruiser ever built, with the contemporary USS Tennessee, so the Tennessee class armoured cruisers, being the last generation of armoured cruisers the US Navy would actually build, because pretty much around about the same time that the last few ships of both classes were rolling off the shipyards, Dreadnought came about, and the US Navy started having to build Dreadnoughts, and Congress was doing its usual thing of, yes, you must build us a world-class navy. No, we're not going to pay for it. And so for the next 15 or so years, the US Navy was faced with a choice of, you can have escorts and cruisers, or you can have battleships, but you can't have both. And so by the time there was enough money available to keep the US battle line up to strength and actually build something like a cruiser or a destroyer to go with it, it was pretty much the end of the First World War. And so the next class of cruiser that the US would actually build would be the Omaha-class scout cruisers, which, of course, built in a completely different technological paradigm and to completely different specifications. And so there wasn't really any carryover from one to the other, unfortunately. Batman's pet goldfish, of all people, asks what happens to torpedoes that miss their targets. It depends on the era and the navy in question, so there's more to his question in the actual comments, so I'll go over some of those points. If they're launched in a harbour, if they hit a wall or some other solid object, then yes, they generally will explode, because it's a contact detonator. It doesn't know whether it's hit concrete, a rock, or the side of a ship. If they run aground, it depends on how they run aground, because the contact detonators are functioning on the basis of a sudden, sharp impact that will throw the relevant parts of the mechanism around such that the thing will detonate. So if, let's say, there's a fairly steep sandbank or a rocky beach and they slam into that, then that might be enough of a short stop for them to explode. Conversely, if it's a shallow beach or some nice and soft sand, they might just run up and run out of fuel and stop, at which point you now have a live torpedo on your hand, which, yeah, good luck disarming that, because you get one thing wrong and that's going to end very badly for you. But it wasn't unknown, and of course the contact detonating fuse might also fail to work. So here you can see one that was salvaged from Pearl Harbor, and one of the Japanese submarine launch torpedoes was salvaged in Australia after one of them ran up onto a beach. So yeah, you could end up with just dud torpedoes floating around or sitting on a sandbank that you could salvage and have a look at. As for torpedoes launched at sea, it depends on the nation and the timeline. So some torpedoes would have, and it's more common these days, would have a timer or some other form of mechanism so that when it runs out of juice, it will just explode. Mostly to preserve the secrets of the torpedo's technology. Conversely, if they don't have that, which is more common the further back in time you go, then yeah, they'll just run out of fuel, and normally, because they're now considerably lighter, because they've burned off all their fuel, and also that fuel space is now filled up with fumes and such, they'll normally actually pop to the surface. How long they stay on the surface is another matter. It won't be forever and a day, because there are, of course, exhaust vents to allow gases to escape, and once the torpedo is no longer running and those gases aren't being produced, that does let water back in, so they will eventually fill up and sink. So yes, if you think about how many torpedoes were launched in World War I and World War II, and how many of those missed, there are thousands of torpedoes sitting on the bottom of the seafloor in various locations, with the sole caveat that many of the torpedoes that were fired in the deep ocean, say in the Battle of the Atlantic, probably aren't intact. Partly because, well, assuming they survived the drop, they would have dropped several miles and got up to a fair old speed before slamming into something possibly solid, which may have set them off. Also, pressure may well crush them and scatter them to the four winds, and in some cases pressure may even set off the warheads. So it's not a case of every single torpedo that was fired that didn't detonate on or near the surface is somewhere down there, but there probably are several hundred to several thousand random torpedoes or large fragments of torpedoes just sitting around on the seabed in various places. And they do occasionally show up in fishing nets or get washed ashore or whatever. Joshua Calvert asks, were there any attempts to use deck-mounted propellers or jets to move warships, similar to what can be seen on swampboats or LCACs? Aboard warships? No. There have been some weird and wonderful experiments with civilian ships and test ships, but in terms of actual warships, not really. And that's for two basic reasons. One is efficiency, and the other is the type of propulsion. And the type of propulsion is important because a jet or a propeller moves air, shockingly enough, at least in what we're talking about this way. We're not talking about a screw propeller underwater. But air is, roughly speaking, 1,000 times less dense than water. So if you move a given volume of air, you're producing 1/1000th, again approximately, of the thrust that you would be producing if you were moved the same volume of water. And obviously screw propellers move water, so they don't need to move anywhere near the volume of water to produce the same level of thrust. So a screw propeller will be massively better at moving a ship, and since a ship is moving through the water, you have to produce an awful lot of force, because obviously moving through the water resists you. The reason propellers and jets work very well on aircraft is because the aircraft has to move through the air, so you can displace air to move through air, that's fine. If you are moving through water, you really need to displace water, otherwise you're going to end up moving millions upon millions upon millions of cubic feet of air in order to crawl forwards. And the other part of that is efficiency. So even if you have something that's very shallow riding, like a swamp boat or an LCAC, you are still using an awful lot of power to move something that's actually going to weigh relatively little. So if you take an LCAC as an example, at full load, it doesn't even hit 200 tons, but it needs 16,000 horsepower for it to go motoring along. Now, fair enough, it can motor along at a fair old clip, but when you look at early destroyers, they're able to hit 35, 36 knots at a displacement that's 2 to 3 times what an LCAC displaces, and they're using about half to 2/3 of the propulsion power, and that's with the incredibly inefficient, relative to modern day propulsion plants, of the late 1800s. So that gives you some idea of actually just how inefficient this kind of propulsion is when it comes to shipping. If you put that kind of power plant, for say an LCAC, on a small aircraft, yeah, you'd move really, really quick, but even that small amount of contact with the water that a hovercraft like an LCAC has drops its efficiency and its overall maximum speed quite considerably. So, I mean, even when it's fully loaded, it loses almost half its total maximum top speed. So, yeah, unfortunately, outside of hovercraft and those kinds of very, very shallow draft, as far as warships are concerned, very light vehicles, you're not going to see propellers or jets used to move warships in the context of the classical thought of using them as direct propulsion. Now, of course, modern gas turbines in many ways act in a manner similar to some forms of jet propulsion, and of course you have water jets, but it's not in the manner that's being discussed here. Gottjäger asks, if the Australians had built 6 1944 light cruisers, how would they compare to their contemporaries? How long would they last, and what would they do? And how would the 5.25-inch Mark IV in triple mounts compare to the Mark I in twin mounts for rate of fire? How useful would they be? So this theoretical ship stems out of the cruiser design N2, which was itself an outgrowth of the 1943 Royal Navy cruiser program design deliberations. And that looked at a variety of 5.25 and 6-inch gun cruisers with 3 or 4 turrets, with guns in twin or triple mounts, with an emphasis on dual-purpose high-angle fire. And N2, which was the one that was brought forward for consideration before it got squashed by higher-up ranking officers later on, had 4 triple 5.25-inch gun mounts. Now, the Australians had considered this for their own ships as well. There's a rather interesting series of papers about it. But in terms of how they'd compare to their contemporaries, well, the thing is, if they'd been laid down, if we're looking at it realistically, if they'd been laid down in 1944, then I don't think they would have been finished in the manner that they were designed for. If they had been somehow, they would have been completed after the war. Now, in that respect, radar-guided anti-aircraft fire from the 5.25 was actually pretty effective towards the end of the Second World War, once many of the issues with the original mounting had been sorted out, and this would have been a newer one, so hopefully they wouldn't have repeated the same mistakes. So, as long-range anti-aircraft ships, they actually probably would have been pretty effective, the main question being how much of a rate of fire they could put up. It was suggested that 12 rounds per minute for the triple mount would be possible. But, well, that would have been pretty good, considering you got 12 rounds per minute and with 12 guns, you're talking about 144 radar-guided 5.25-inch proximity-fused rounds. There's a fair bit of decent long-range AA firepower. Now, realistically, though, when you look at things like the HMS Tiger and such, which were laid down actually maybe fractionally earlier, the delays caused by wartime construction and then the subsequent technological advancements probably wouldn't have seen them, as I said, completed as designed. Now, there's a variety of routes that could have gone down. They might have then gone and said, well, we don't actually have a triple 5.25-inch mount at that point. It would have had to have been developed during 44-45. So during that development period, they could have looked at maybe automating the turret with autoloaders. So that would have been actually quite interesting, because we know with some degree of success they did manage to get the twin 6-inch mount that eventually went on HMS Tiger to work. So making an autoloader for a 5.25 shouldn't be out of the question. Getting 3 of them into a triple turret would be interesting, but nevertheless, if they'd managed to get a auto-loading triple 5.25, that would have been one devastating anti-aircraft cruiser. If the Australians had kept them in service, I can see the Royal Navy asking to borrow 1 or 2 of them for the Falklands War. The other alternatives would have been, when the auto-loading 6-inch, twin 6-inch that went on Tiger was developed, they might have decided to swap them out. Swapping triple 5.25 for twin 6 is eminently doable in theory, at least given that the ships probably wouldn't be halfway built yet. And the additional weight of the auto-loading systems would have made up for the fact that it's only a 0.75-inch increase in caliber while still dropping a barrel. Another way they might have gone about it is, if they didn't want to go down the rapid-firing 6-inch and the auto-loading 5.25, maybe for whatever reason doesn't work out, or is going to be too expensive, or is going to take too long, they might go with the twin 4.5-inch mounts that were being mounted at that point on the Daring class, which of course Australia was in the process of buying in the post-war environment as well. So that would have led to a commonality of parts, and with the drop in weight from triple 5.25 to twin 4.5, they might have been able to maybe get another mounting in a sort of a sea turret position, replacing one of the Bofors, so almost like a miniature Dido. And you might also have been able to fit 1 or more, well, hopefully more than 1, down the side as a secondary battery, kind of, but is also the same caliber and type as the primary battery. So you might then have seen something truly terrifying if you were a aircraft coming in on approach. So you may well have then ended up with something very similar to the French Colbert class anti-aircraft cruisers that were built in the 50s. And similarly to those, you might have seen them then converted into some form of missile ship. But I suspect with the utility of a sort of a 9 to 10,000 ton hull displacement, whatever format their gun armament eventually took, they probably would have been converted at some point into some form of hybrid ship or missile vessel, and probably would have seen a very long service life. And maybe not all 6, but certainly at least 1 or 2. And here's a name I'm going to get horribly wrong. Nguyen Than Tung Lin, I think, asks, if Dönitz had failed to placate Hitler after the Battle of Barents Sea and the entire surface fleet of the Kriegsmarine were scrapped and resources diverted to U-boats, how would the naval scene of World War II in Europe change? So it actually probably makes Germany lose the war a fraction faster. And there's 3 main arms to that. Firstly, if the Kriegsmarine surface fleet is scrapped, bearing in mind that the Barents Sea takes place at the end of 1942, so talking about early 1943, then that means when the Arctic convoys get going in earnest, there's no Deutschland class, there's no Scharnhorst, there's no Tirpitz, etc. to menace those convoys. Therefore, the only threat to those convoys now is the Luftwaffe and the submarines. That means, in turn, that the Royal Navy and the US Navy don't have to worry about sending battleship escorts and fleet carrier escorts, etc. We don't get PQ-17 and so forth. And so instead, these convoys are just sailing with slightly beefier anti-aircraft and anti-submarine escorts, whilst the big fleet units go off to play elsewhere. So fewer losses to the Arctic convoys, and also simultaneously more freedom of action for various Allied capital ships. I mean, you think about the sheer amount of effort that went into sinking something like Tirpitz between various carrier strikes and the midget subs, etc. All of that can now be pointed somewhere else. So the Allies are going to get a lot more utility out of their ships. I mean, you might even see some of the modern ships like Washington and King George V deployed to the Mediterranean. So you might even have sort of a Littorio versus modern battleship face-off before Italy decides it's had enough. And of course, with Russia receiving more supplies because fewer convoys are being sunk, or ships inside the convoys are being sunk, that gives Russia a bit of a leg up or the Soviet Union, when it's taking on Germany. So that's one aspect. Second aspect is the effect of pulling in all the German surface fleet for scrapping and then redistributing those crews to U-boats and building U-boats to accommodate them is going to take a while. It's not going to be an effect that's felt immediately. And the big sort of turning point in the Battle of the Atlantic is probably therefore going to come and go in early to mid-1943 before the overall effects of this move are really felt. Now, that might then stretch out the Battle of the Atlantic. The decline of the U-boat arm might be somewhat elongated and there'll be more losses, but at the same time, again, the Allies don't have to worry so much about surface raiders and such like, and so they can afford to put more resources into the production of escort ships, etc. And even if the Germans are able to produce more U-boats, and they now have men to put in them, they're not fully trained U-boat crews. And even if they're retrained to operate U-boats, they're still relatively green U-boat operation crews. Even if they were particularly good at operating a battleship, that doesn't necessarily translate into operating a U-boat. And it was the loss of skilled crews more than anything that really began to hurt the Kriegsmarine U-boat arm by the mid-war period. And yeah, that you can't just replace them with people who have served their entire professional career on a completely different kind of ship. And the third and final aspect is to do with the later war period when the Soviets are on the advance, because some of the surviving ships like Lützow, Prinz Eugen, etc. did provide both escort and offshore fire support to elements of the German army as they were falling back. So without them being in existence anymore because they've been scrapped, those also don't take place, and U-boats aren't particularly good at providing anti-shore fire support, so the German army would be facing a Soviet army that has somewhat more supplies thanks to better Arctic convoys, success rates. They'd be in turn have less fire support from the shore, so small changes, but it is going to mean somewhat greater losses and a quicker fallback for the German army. And as we said, Allied battleships, heavy cruisers, aircraft carriers, etc. are going to be able to be deployed to do other things, which is going to increase the utility of the Western Allies' ability to counter enemy forces. You might even see more deployments to the Pacific without a surface fleet threat. Once Italy's taken care of, there isn't really much reason not to start deploying large numbers of carriers, battleships and cruisers over to the Pacific. Custodian Shield Captain asks, why did the notion of the galley slave come about in popular media despite most classical navies being hesitant to put anything but freemen in the role of oarsmen? Also, how popular was it in galley versus galley fights to attempt to de-oar an opponent to cripple their movement capabilities as opposed to straight up boarding and ramming? And in the event that they were de-oared, how many spares would typically be carried on a particular galley? The galley slave issue is around in popular media because they did exist, but it was more often a case in the medieval period galleys, running up into the Renaissance era galleys, than it was so much in the, as you say, in the classical era. So because it's more proximate and therefore more written accounts survive, there's a little bit more memory about it, etc. I think that's where this conception that if you are in a galley, you are a slave comes about. Basically, because that is the most recent memory that civilization generally has of that particular thing. Plus, of course, as with anything that's seen as negative, it does tend to get blown up quite a bit in the retelling. So you see all sorts of things like this in naval history where, for example, you have this idea that goes around in a lot of pop culture that almost everybody on a Age of Sail warship was a victim of a press gang, for example. It's like, no, there were press gangs, and the people who got press ganged usually weren't particularly happy about it, but one, it wasn't quite as bad as they make out in terms of the discipline, and two, there weren't as many press ganged individuals in service in Age of Sail warships as the media would like to make out. Now, in galley versus galley fights, de-oaring an opponent was pretty popular because it cripples your opponent's ability to maneuver in an environment where maneuver warfare is pretty useful. Now, obviously, there are sails, but one, the sails tend to be taken in before the fight gets properly underway, and two, the sails only offer you a limited range of motion. So, as compared to the oars, where you can go full 360. Now, if a galley was de-oared, you were literally up the creek without a paddle, because a successful de-oaring would take out dozens of oars, at which point there's no way you're carrying anywhere near that many spares. Maybe a galley would carry a half dozen to a dozen spares in case of general wastage and breakage, but there's no way you're replacing an entire side of oars, especially in combat, even if you had that many, and you don't. And apart from making you not particularly agile and therefore more vulnerable to being boarded or rammed in a situation that's ideal for the boarder or rammer, it also means if you can't maneuver and you can't row away, you can be peppered with ballistic weaponry, whether that be arrows, catapults, fire pots, whatever, which helps soften you up to, again, make any further boarding or ramming actions even easier for your enemies. Brother Fluffy asks, I've seen more than a few documentaries, books or articles that like to identify either USS Lexington or IJN Shoho as the first carrier to be sunk by another carrier in battle. Is there any reason why HMS Hermes, which was sunk by the Kido Butai the month prior at Ceylon, doesn't get that particular credit? The reason that Hermes doesn't get the credit is, well, to be perfectly honest, it wasn't a battle. Hermes didn't have any aircraft of any particular use aboard, and she was sunk whilst trying to evade. Now, if she'd had, it wasn't exactly the world's biggest carrier at that point, so even if she'd had her full complement of aircraft aboard, it still wouldn't have been anything like really a battle, more a very one-sided one, if you want to call it that. But yeah, she wasn't in combat, she wasn't trying to counter-strike the Japanese carrier, she wasn't looking for them, she was near enough, as it makes no difference, effectively unarmed. And so, while she was the first carrier sunk by another carrier, it would be a bit of a stretch to say it was sunk in battle. Whereas, at least with Lexington and Shoho, they were actually in a fight with each other and each other's fleets, relatively speaking. And the reason why people sort of somewhat argue about Lexington and Shoho being whether the first carrier to be sunk in battle is, well, it basically comes down to whether or not you count Shoho as a true fleet carrier. She was pretty small. So, yeah, if you want to go with first carrier sunk by another carrier, it's Hermes. First carrier sunk by another carrier in battle, it's Shoho. First fleet carrier sunk by another carrier in battle, it's Lexington. Tuning 3434 asks, Royal Navy heavy cruiser doctrine and its influence on design. What was their goal with the County class, and how was the Royal Navy planning to be following up on this heavy cruiser - supercruiser wise? Well, I have actually done a video on interwar Royal Navy cruiser doctrine with Dr. Clark, and, well, just examining individual classes could take entire hour-long Wednesday specials. But very briefly, with the County class, the Royal Navy was pretty much trying to do everything. They were built under the auspices of the Washington Treaty, so 10,000-ton displacement limit, 8-inch main gun armament. And the Royal Navy was kind of faced with the problem of Well, now that that limit is set, they knew that pretty much everybody was going to try and build to that limit, so they had to as well. The Royal Navy historically had actually preferred, outside of a few random intervals and one-offs, generally had preferred more numerous smaller cruisers because they had an empire to cover, as opposed to fewer larger cruisers. Say the odd diversion, things like HMS Powerful and Terrible, and the battle cruisers being somewhat exceptions to that. But with the County class, knowing that they were going to have to build a ship capable of taking on these other big heavy ships, they had to do that. They had to think about a ship that was going to be operating overseas for long periods of time, hence the very high freeboard, good seakeeping, that kind of thing. They also knew that the ship would face an aerial threat, so every gun had to be capable of anti-aircraft fire, and yes, that included initially in the first subclasses the 8-inch guns. They could go all the way up to 70 degrees. Didn't actually think to put an anti-aircraft fire control system or dedicated anti-aircraft shells on board, but they could at least point menacingly at aircraft that were very high up. And, well, can you imagine what would be left of an aircraft that was hit by an 8-inch contact fuse HE shell? Very bad luck at that point, but nevertheless. And they were also thinking, well, these things are going to have to form our fleet screen at some point, so they're going to have to face other enemy heavy cruisers in battle, but bearing in mind that Japan was looking more and more likely to be the enemy, so we were thinking Pacific theatre, and even if the Americans were the enemy, still across an ocean of some sort or another, so they're going to have to operate alone for a while. So that means they're probably going to have to do commerce protection, but they're also going to have to probably do commerce raiding as well, so hence the torpedo launchers, amongst other things. And so, yeah, they were basically trying to do absolutely everything. Commerce protection, commerce raiding, fleet screening, scouting, fighting other enemy heavy cruisers, forming an ancillary part of a battle line to finish off crippled enemy battleships, kind of like what Dorsetshire would do with Bismarck. And on top of all of that, there was all sorts of design studies. Now, the counties ended up with a relatively conventional 2 twins forward, 2 twins aft super firing arrangement. But there were all sorts of weird and wacky design concepts going on. Twin turrets, triple turrets. They even actually had a very long and hard look at making the counties actually something of a halfway house between the Nelson's design and eventually the Japanese Tonei design, i.e. an all-forward armament. It was a very, very interesting little bit of a design and doctrine development. Now, once they built them and realised just how expensive they were, they very rapidly started looking for cheaper smaller alternatives. So that's why you got the Yorks, which is effectively a diminutive version with one less turret. And then with the advent of more rapid-firing 6-inch weapons, you've got the Towns and their commerce protection and scout and raiding variants, Leanders and the Arethusas, or the Arethusas are pretty much the only ones that you could really point to and say these are dedicated commerce protection. Even the Leanders had definite fleet and raiding roles. So, yeah, the county class were kind of the big overseas high point of cruiser design, and everything else was an attempt to get as much out of the treaty displacement limits and the budget as you possibly could. In terms of following it up, the iterative development, and what some people call the Surrey class, was looking at more of a straight combat role, so more protection, less speed, slightly heavier armament in terms of the secondary weaponry, still retaining the 8-inch guns. And that was pretty much that for the majority of the 1930s until towards the end of the 1930s, when they were thinking they're going to have to bring out heavy cruisers again because people kept building heavy cruisers. And so there were a number of designs. You had heavy cruiser designs that were using triple 8-inch turrets. You had heavy cruiser designs using various forms of the 9.2-inch gun, obviously updated. You had some theoretical supercruiser designs that used either 4 888s or more numerous 9.2s, but they were all under consideration at the point that World War II broke out and put an end to it all. The Royal Navy generally didn't get quite on board the supercruiser bandwagon the same way that the Japanese, the Germans to a certain extent, and the Americans did in terms of going for similar numbers but even bigger guns. They tended, at least as far as the design studies that they had, mostly tended towards 8 or 9.2 inch guns, but just a lot more of them. Bill Brockman asks, what would be your favourite or most admirable ship from a smaller navy during World War I and World War II? This could be based off a single action or an entire period of service. So I'm going to pick 3 candidates, single action, entire period of service, and aesthetics. So for entire period of service, it's got to be the Bliskovica. Apologies for any mangling of that particular name, but yeah, it's just got a fantastic service. I mean, it's a ship that was involved in World War II literally from the first day that the war was declared, and actually managed to make it through the entire war, which is in and of itself a remarkable achievement, but also managed to fight a rather remarkable series of engagements along the way, including, as covered in the video that I did on the ship itself, the defence of the wonderfully named town of Cowes on the Isle of Wight, where it single-handedly held off a fairly large Luftwaffe bombing raid. Aesthetically, the Spanish heavy cruiser Canarias, I think, has to be up there as one of my top favourite ships. I mean, given that the last Spanish attempt at large warships was the España miniature dreadnoughts, which, well, there's a few positive things you might be able to say about them, but aesthetics definitely aren't one of them. But then they managed to come up with this thing, which was, yeah, it looks the business, doesn't it? It looks like a pretty nice, solid, heavy cruiser. And it is. And for single action, although Piron's trolling of the Bismarck got very, very close, I would have to say the, again, horribly mispronouncing, Abraham Kranjchen? I can never get that thing right. But anyway, that thing. The Dutch ship that pretended it was going to be an island and managed to evade the Japanese Navy and then survive the war. That's one very, very impressive feat, considering that ships from all sides were dropping left, right, and centre in the face of the Japanese advance. And this little ship was just like, no, I am island. You cannot see me. I will do a sneak all the way to Australia. And it works. I think that has to really be up there for refuge in audacity and tree branches. Waldo739 asks, how would the US ship design be different if the Panama Canal was 130 feet wide instead of 110? Well, the effects probably would, well, they'd only be felt in the post-World War I environment and going forward, because up until that point, the ships that were being designed, well, they weren't big enough for their beams to overly trouble the 110-foot limit. But once you get onto things like the Lexington class and the South Dakota class, then they were having to start to build to the Panama Canal width limits. And then obviously once you get into the Essex class, the North Carolinas, the 1930 South Dakotas and the Iowas, now it's a very major concern. And this is actually one of the reasons why US battleships of the post-treaty era, so North Carolina, South Dakota and Iowa, have such a distinctive appearance. When you look at the top-down profiles of Littorio, Richelieu, King George V, Bismarck, etc., as I mentioned in a video a few weeks ago about ship design, you see that their hull forms are not teardrop shaped, but they're kind of oval in a way, whereas the US battleships tend to have very long, thin bows and then straight lines for a good portion, and then just a rounded off stern. This is in part due to the restrictions of the Panama Canal width. Physically, you can't go any wider. So if the Panama Canal is 130 foot wide, I suspect the hull form design of every US capital ship from the Lexington forward is going to be quite substantially different, because if you look back at the standards, the Colorados and before, you see that kind of pointed oval, almost eye-shaped design is very much present in the US ships just as much as anybody else's. It doesn't obviously affect cruiser design, destroyer design, or even the Yorktowns, believe it or not, all that much. But yeah, for the battleship design, you would have seen a very different hull form, which in and of itself probably would have been slightly more efficient. So how that would have played out in terms of overall speed and protection firepower of US capital ships would actually be quite interesting, because with a slightly more efficient hull form, you could either get a slightly faster vessel for if you keep the overall same power plant and armament and protection, or you could reduce the power plant slightly to get the same kind of target speed, and with that you could buy yourself a little bit more protection or a little bit more armament. Now, I don't necessarily think you'd be able to buy yourself substantially more armament with the slight displacement changes, but you might be able to buy yourself a bit more protection. And if you can do that, you then might not only see hull form change, but you might also see the armor layout, armor thickness, and armor design type on US battleships change slightly. So something more along the lines of what would eventually be seen on the Montanas, as opposed to what was seen in the North Carolina, South Dakotas, and Iowas, at least in, as a layout and placement, if not overall thickness. Mikko Leitner asks, did the Soviets get any useful service out of the Gangut-class battleships during World War II, and how would they have fared against the Scharnhorsts if the Germans decided to commit them to the Baltic after their Channel dash? Depends how you define useful service. There were 4 Ganguts built. One of them was completely out as a practical warship by the time of World War II. You had 2 in the Baltic, 1 in the Black Sea. I finally got those the right way round. And, well, the one that was down in the Black Sea did a bit of shore bombardment, a little bit of supply and evacuation, and then the Soviets got too scared to use it because the German advance in that area, the Luftwaffe had already sunk a bunch of Soviet ships, and they didn't want to lose a battleship, so it kind of sat out most of the rest of the war. So, yeah, a bit of shore bombardment for a battleship. I don't know if you class that as a particularly useful service. I mean, it was probably helpful at the time, but compared to the cost of maintaining a battleship, probably not all that great. Up north, well, one pilot, Rudel, managed to blow up one of the 2 battleships pretty quickly, so that definitely didn't get much useful service. It was a bit of shore bombardment on the way during the German advance, and then boom. And the other one, October Revolution, because I'm not trying to pronounce that in Russian again, that kind of did on and off shore bombardment duties. It did also get bombed and damaged, so mid part of the war it was kind of out of action, but did manage to get back in on the old shore bombardment missions in the latter part of the war. So yeah, sum total, if you added the contributions of all 3 ships together, was probably 1 ship's worth of whole war shore bombardment. So, I mean, it helped. A battery of 12-inch guns never goes awry, but yeah, I wouldn't necessarily say it was worth keeping the 3 of them around, given the overall effect. As far as how they would have fared against Scharnhorst if the Germans decided to come into the Baltic, probably not that well. They're not. I mean, Scharnhorst, fair enough, has got 11-inch guns, but they are modernised 11-inch guns. The Ganguts, their armour's okay, but the Scharnhorst are more modern. They've got better fire control systems. Fair enough, the Ganguts' guns are pretty nasty, but the Scharnhorst are just, they're bigger, they're more modern, and more especially, they're much, much faster. So any kind of engagement between them, bearing in mind that if that did happen, that it would be a time where the Luftwaffe has mostly air superiority as well, the Ganguts would be in a position of they can't run, and the Scharnhorst can dictate exactly how this battle goes, at which point I would probably say the Scharnhorst would have the advantage. But with a caveat that, let's say, those 12-inch guns are still pretty nasty, so if they landed a good salvo or 2, it could go either way. Brian Roper asks, can you identify some of the more important changes that the Japanese made to design and practice following the Fourth Fleet incident? Well, that will be covered in substantially more detail as and when I get round to actually doing a full Wednesday special on the Fourth Fleet incident, because it is quite the complicated and fairly impactful series of disasters. So yeah, there were quite a wide variety of impacts. So in brief, one of the major things was it forced Japan to reconsider just exactly what it was trying to do, given the environment it found itself in, because Japanese ship design had been on a very particular trajectory of trying to do the maximum amount possible with the fewest number of hulls possible. And that wasn't to say they were trying to build particularly few ships, but they vaguely acknowledged the fact that they weren't going to be able to outbuild the British or the Americans. They thought they could get close, but not quite, and so they were trying to get individually superior vessels. But obviously, with a treaty putting in displacement limits, that meant that things like the Kagero class couldn't be repeated, and what they'd been trying to do was as small a lightweight hull as possible, maximum offensive firepower, basically trying to cram the firepower that they were getting out of Washington Treaty era hulls into the new London Naval Treaty spec hulls, which didn't really work out for them too well. So this meant the downrating and cancellation of a number of lighter vessels that had been designed as kind of along the same lines that the Germans were designing their smaller light craft that they would call torpedo boats and would eventually grow to be the size of light destroyers. But the Japanese were kind of trying to do the same thing with large fleet destroyers like the Kageros and then these smaller torpedo boats. With the lessons of the Fourth Fleet incident, it became clear that a lot of these smaller torpedo boats just were not seaworthy flat out. They had to have significant reductions in their firepower, and even then they could only be used for coastal defence. So that took a bunch of them off the board as far as fleet units went, and it led to the cancellation of others. It also meant for destroyers like the Hatsuharas, which were following on from the Kageros with the sort of Kagero armament but on a smaller hull, these needed to be downrated in their armament, and subsequently all further destroyer designs they had to make a choice of either downrating their offensive firepower or lying about their displacement in order to ostensibly comply with treaty requirements. And there were also a bunch of stability improvement measures taken on ships that were under construction at the time, like the Megami class, because they would all been following this same design principle, which had been shown up as quite deficient. So stronger hull construction, less topside heavy weights causing stability issues, etc. Now, it's got to be borne in mind that what is generally referred to as the Fourth Fleet incident was a big typhoon in the mid-1930s, but there were a number of lead-up incidents that generally fall under the same overall categorization. So that's kind of those bits, and then you have the big typhoon, which shows that in actual fact a lot of the measures that they'd taken in response to the earlier incidents hadn't quite been adequate, and that led to even more stability improvement measures, even more structural improvements and strengthening, and this all meant that compared to their initial design specs, a lot of cruisers, destroyers, and even some aircraft carriers ended up weighing more, going slower, and having less armament than had originally been envisaged. And obviously then that would have significant knock-on effects when it came to World War II, because, well, they were just less capable units. Not that they would have won the war with them acting at their original design specs, because they would have been relatively easy to knock over. They just would have been a lot more vicious about fighting back in the first place. So effectively it acted as a bit of a reality check. The Japanese had been getting a little bit carried away with the, the enemy can design their ships to do this, we can design our ships to do that better by cutting these corners. And then it turns out Mother Nature says, well, if you're going to operate in an area like the Pacific where typhoons exist, you really, really can't. And finally for this week, Rich Fieler asks, with the US and other navies using nuclear power, how is this going to affect the ability to take a significant capital ship and turn it into a museum? It's not impossible, but it does make it more difficult because it makes it more expensive, and that's for a number of reasons. I mean, firstly, museum ships cost money to run, and so you want to minimise the overall cost, which is why so many museum ships are in non-running condition, because keeping the engines in operational state is quite expensive. The cost of keeping a nuclear reactor up and running, especially in a museum ship context, would be so stupendously expensive as to basically make it impractical completely. There's also the fact that, well, it's a nuclear reactor, and if you don't have the money to keep it running and operational, things could go rather horribly wrong. And if you've got a lot of civilians coming aboard and having a look at this lovely museum ship, the last thing you want is a reactor incident or leak. Then you, to be perfectly honest, also have the fact that these days, even if you decommission some of the earliest nuclear-powered ships, like, say, CVN-65, the Enterprise, you still have the problem that there are an awful lot of people out there who really would like to know the secrets of even a 1960s-era nuclear reactor. And if it's open to civilians, well, that makes it very easy for people to come in and take photographs, etc. So a lot of these reactor technologies are still classified to various levels. So, yeah, all of these mitigate against having the reactor on board. Now, there is a way around that. You can just take the reactor out, but this is where the expense comes in. Now, the reason you've had this ballistic missile submarine on your screens is because this is the French nuclear ballistic missile submarine Redoutable, which is a museum ship. And the way they did that is they just took the reactor out completely, put in a replacement big section of steel tubing, and I think the reactor space is now just a big dining area. So it is going to affect the authenticity, if you like, of the ship, because you're not going to have the reactor space there anymore. But on the other hand, I mean, if you are converting a ship into a museum ship, the engine room is usually, and the power plant is usually, a fairly large portion of the overall ship, and if you can replace that with just a blank empty space, which you can then use for other things, like a nice big dining hall or a event hall or a shop or something, gift shop, then that's probably actually long-term good for the ship as a viable running option commercially. But the expense and effort involved of actually cutting into the ship, taking out all the reactors, and then basically patching it all back together again, this is going to be quite the expense, and this is going to be the major barrier to making nuclear-powered vessels into museum ships, because if they do want to do that, they're going to need a lot more work done to them to get them to that final state than would otherwise be involved in most cases. So, yeah, it will probably mean a lot fewer museum ships going forward, but the ones that do get converted will probably be fairly interesting in terms of what they turn those rooms into. I mean, the thing is, with something the sheer size of something like the Enterprise, and with so many reactors in it, it was always going to be economically completely non-feasible to do so. And especially with a carrier, the sort of benefit of having a big empty space at the end of it, even if you can justify the expense, is probably a lot less, considering you have the hangar deck, which is also a relatively big empty space, unless you want to do something like the Intrepid in New York has done and stick a bunch of aircraft in there and have it function as both a small aircraft museum as well as a museum ship. And that brings us to the end of another episode of the Drydock. Thank you very much for listening, and there's not really much channel admin for this week, other than to say that if you happen to be in London or the vicinity of London on Tuesday the 2nd, and you can't think of anything better to do, then I will be in the vicinity of HMS Belfast and the Golden Hind replica near Tower Bridge in London, doing a bit of filming. And so if you're there after, well, filming will probably wrap up around 2:30, 3 o'clock. So yeah, if you're there just after that, feel free to come and say hi, have a chat, whatever. And yeah, maybe see one or two of you there, assuming that the weather isn't completely awful. Other than that, see you in another video.